Benny Goodman and his music.
And good morning, everybody. Hey, Chris. Hey, Martin. Morning, Karen. Hey, Dina. Hey, Jean. Morning, Kathleen, over on YouTube. Morning, Mona and Heather and Andrea and Gail. Pop on kind of all at once for this sometimes. Hey, Octavio and Patty and Cindy in Detroit.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid
Hey, Dad. Boker Tov, Lisa. Happy Hanukkah to you as well.
In the urban room of
Hey, Bridget, thanks for those videos the other day, yesterday.
And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest
Beverly, yeah, I had a good time in D.C. Hey, Daniel. Hey, Gladys. Hey, Luann. Luann. Hey, John and Laura. Good morning, Betsy. Hey, Nikki. And Lorena. And Toby and Bob. Hey, Debbie. And Toby. Morning, Vicky. You see Priya's walking around in the background right now. There she was. Miles is on the desk. And Marita and Georgia and Laura. Oh, look who just heard his name. Hey, Christine. Hey, Zap. Bridget. Happy Prohibition Repeal Day to you, too. Hey, Ellen. No, Laura, I haven't seen that one. Hey, Rodney. I thought I'd dress up fancy today, so we're talking about fancy places. Still pretty sure I couldn't pass. Hey, Robert. Hey, Heather. Hey, Heidi and Ann. Hey, Miles, after I do the presentation, you can do some jumping, okay? But I gotta do the presentation first. We got some sleet coming down in Chicago today. Jordana, that sounds fancy to me. Morning, Carol. Hey, Cheryl. Thanks, Larry. Hey. Which rich person lived there? That would be the Kimball house. That's the house that Kimball Pianos built. Hey, John. Hey, Donna. Hey, Eileen. And to the right of it was a guy named Coleman Ames, a hardware dude. Hey, Eileen. Hey, Priya. Hey, Georgia. Morning, Todd, over on YouTube. Miles, you can't try to climb me like that. You just can't. You can't knock things down like that. Come on. Morning, Ed. Hey, Rodney. Yeah. Miles wants all the attention today. But Priya's getting her share back over there, too. Yeah, I mentioned you. Morning, Susan. Top of the morning to you, Heidi, and hey, Carrie.
Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing With All My Heart.
Morning, Emily. You know, Miles wants all the attention today. He's just sitting here Curling up on things. If I could have lived on Prairie Avenue, which house would I pick? Good question. I like the Keith house, partly because it's still there. Hey, Lynn. Hey, Judy. Betsy, yeah, they get along great now. And I think they're about to start fighting. Hey, Ava and Mona. Hey, Judy. Priya, do you want to come up on the desk too? Is that it? Miles, can you? Can. You learning to jump on things is going to be dangerous. Morning, Kelly. Hey, Sue. Ah, thank you, Mona. Gravity's Double Rainbow over on YouTube. That's one way of looking at it. Now, if I get like a small town group on a bus or something and point out this field over there, they think it's hilarious that I call that a field. Marine. Oh, I got both cats on the desk now. Hey, Priya, you want to come say hi to all the nice people? All the nice people here, Priya. Good morning, Christine. Okay. Yes, it's Marshall's Field. There's a good Gomer Pyle joke in here someplace, too, you know. And I stole it from Beavis and Butthead. It's probably not really a Sunday morning kind of joke. Morning, Kendra. Miles continues to just hang out on the desk. I don't know how well you guys can see that, but he's just curled up.
Benny Goodman goes way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Good morning to all and sundry Mysterians. Well, you have that head scratcher you can go to if you want to be scratched that badly while I'm working. Are these the original lampposts in front of the house? I doubt it. Hey, Loretta. Morning, Aviva. Hey, Gary, Semper Fi. And hey, Tara and Galena. Hey, Lisa. Okay, I'm going to turn off the mail, so hope nobody has further technical problems. Not that I have a chance to answer. Hey, Kathy. Hey, Paul. Hey, Melissa. Hey, Susan. Hey, Chris. We'll give Benny another track to go through. And then we'll get started. I was actually a little late starting today. I think I started at 9:51. Such a slacker. James, this is the Kimball house. Why do people build their houses so big? Because they could.
Those fastened when they played by Benny Goodman. And now another one just in the same vein. Rosetta.
Hey, Denise. Hey, Cindy. A lot of people log on right at 10, so we're going to give Benny Goodman one more song here. Oh, you got snow in Milwaukee now. Let me see how we're doing. I don't think anything's coming down in the sky right now. Eleanor, tell that to every high school teacher I had. James, the Kimballs were of Kimball piano. We'll talk about that later. Once we get underway here. Hey, Connie in Michigan. Hey, April. I'm looking forward to a nice, pleasant afternoon. Oh, well, I got to do this week's Patreon posts. But nice, relaxing afternoon overall. Get back on in the background. I'm on my third time through Get Back. Folks, as soon as Benny wraps up this song, we'll get started properly. Hey, Kathy. It's been warm for us the last couple of days. It was in the high 50s or so in D.C. Hey, Leah. Morning, Julie. Hey, Cindy. All right, I think I got Priya properly distracted with a toy for a while. Oh, thanks for being so good to Layla. And Becky, there will be another Only Minis in the Building episode pretty soon. I'm just still kind of recovering from October. Oh, Brad, I love Ben's Chili Bowl. It's the one thing I got to get when I'm in D.C.
In downtown Chicago. And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of The Bugle Call Rang.
All right. That'll about do it for Benny. I think it is time we go ahead and get started out properly. So welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, so I am incredibly famous. I'm dressed to kill today, too. I'm dressed like Mackey's back in town. So a few quick things. Among my books are Mysterious Chicago, the book, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry. Wrote that one with Michael Glover Smith, who just went with me to D.C. to see the Bob Dylan concert. H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil. The brand new Murder Maps USA, which is starting to show up in stores this week. It got written up in the New York Times. Library Journal called it engrossing. There weren't really any pull quotes in the New York Times review. It was a good one, but about the best thing I can find is a veritable cornucopia, the New York Times. But I'd much rather be a veritable cornucopia than like an alleged cornucopia. How could I face the day? And coming in July, Graceland Cemetery, which is the final resting place of quite a number of the people that we'll be talking about today on Prairie Avenue. Let's just take these pictures down for a second and show you where it is that we're going. We're going to the old Millionaires District from the late 19th and into the early 20th century. Here we have the Chicago Loop, the main downtown area. We'll zoom in here, and if we go a little ways south, just below Grant Park and a few blocks down to 18th Street, right around the lake, you've got this section right over here. We're going to start over on Calumet, then wander our way down Prairie, take a quick journey over onto Cullerton, then back down Prairie a little ways, and back up and around. So this is also a tour that I do as a walking tour occasionally, but we've reached a time of year where people don't really sign up for walking tours too much in Chicago, so we're going to do it virtually. Also, this way I have a cheat sheet in front of me too, which is kind of nice. But yes, Kristen, yes, the Graceland book is very, very different from Murder Maps. Murder Maps is frankly a really gruesome book. I didn't have much to do with the illustrations of it, but they didn't hold back much in that thing. But it is, if you like crime scene photos and maps, it is a very handsome volume. I think it's a really well done book. At least I think so. I honestly haven't even seen a copy of it myself yet. But let's go ahead and get started on our trek through the old Prairie Avenue Millionaire District, which was, being the home of lots of rich people, was also the home of lots and lots of scandal. So, all right, we're going to start out over here on Calumet, where there is this little park. Now, this is called Battle of Fort Dearborn Park. In the background, you can see Soldier Field, or at least like the additional seating that looks like a UFO that landed on top of Soldier Field back there. But this is generally the accepted location of the Battle of Fort Dearborn from 1812. At the time, Chicago looked about like this. There were a couple of houses, there was a fort, and that's about it. But during the War of 1812, word came in that the British were marching on the area, and we didn't have nearly the resources to defend Fort Dearborn against them. So word came in from General Hull to get everybody to Fort Wayne, Indiana. This was going to be a tricky journey, so Captain Nathan Held went out and had a council with the Potawatomi and said, listen, if you'll accompany us, we'll give you all of our guns, all of our ammo, and all of our whiskey. They agreed to the deal, but then Captain Held went back in and all the other officers said something like the 1812 equivalent of, are you completely nuts? So he decided, okay, maybe this wasn't my finest moment, threw away all of the guns and poured all of the whiskey into the river, which at the time looked more like a creek. The river as we know it today is effectively a man-made body of water. It's one of the most heavily engineered waterways in the world. You could just about do a long jump across it back in those days. This, of course, did not go over too well. So on this day of July in 1812, as the British had marched on the fort, about 200 soldiers and their families from Fort Dearborn started walking south, flanked by the Potawatomi and several members of the Miami tribe. They got down to about where we are right now. And they didn't used to call it the Fort Dearborn Massacre for nothing. This was a pretty one-sided fight. It's very difficult to get real details of what happened in the fight because there's several first-hand accounts, but nobody could really write an account of it without making themselves into Indiana Jones. My favorite is one woman wrote her account where she came up to a man who was bleeding and carrying on and looked terrified and said, "Be a man. Look at that man. He's going to die and he's not carrying on like that." And the man said, "Yes, but that man is an atheist. I think I'm going to hell." And then, of course, she makes herself into a further hero. In the end, about 75 of the soldiers and their families were killed. The rest were sold as slaves to the British, who, to their credit, promptly let them go. The bodies were just kind of left lying in the sand around here. They don't like me talking about this, but off the record, when they do construction, they still do occasionally find relics, which is probably the best evidence that it actually did happen right around here. Now, this was a battle. It didn't take place in, 50 square feet or anything like that. Estimates as to where it really happened go from anywhere from back up on Roosevelt, about 6 blocks north of here, all the way down to about 4 blocks south of here. Somewhere in that general vicinity, but again, it was a battle. It could have easily been spread all over that whole place. There wasn't a lot getting in the way at the time. But we're going to move right down the road from here a little bit. See, that's park is off in the distance there. Then down at the corner, we see that house from the beginning that we'll get to next. But first, the 1701 block of Prairie, which at one time was the home of Catherine Dexter and her father, Wirt Dexter, who was a corporate lawyer who worked in relief efforts after the Great Chicago Fire. Now, Catherine Dexter McCormick, his daughter, dutifully attended a lot of the social functions, things like the Mikado Ball held at the Fields Mansion that we'll talk about later. But by all accounts, her favorite thing to do in the neighborhood was wander around looking for relics from the Battle of Fort Dearborn. She was a very study-minded young woman, and eventually became one of the first women to graduate from MIT. Not the first, but one of the first, and also got them to change their policies and change the dress code for women, build more housing for women, and which allowed exponentially more women to go there after her. Now, just around the corner from them, though, right in kind of the empty space, we can see this little drawing right here. This is a tree that was right in the middle of the grounds and right in the middle of the street with a little fence around it. They called this the Massacre Tree. So called because it was believed to be a relic from the Battle of Fort Dearborn that still actually had bullet holes in it. Whether it was real or not, is kind of in dispute, as these things are, but it was right in front of the home by the 1880s of George Pullman. I believe George Pullman is out there in the comments today. He pretty generally is. Now, George Pullman was the guy who famously built a whole town for his employees, and much nicer than your average factory town. He was the guy from the Pullman Palace Car Company, the last word in luxury railroad travel. The architect Solon Beeman designed his house, as well as designing pretty much the whole town of Pullman. Another whole neighborhood in Hyde Park that we need to get to this week. Maybe that'll be one of the upcoming morning mini tours. This is the Hotel Florence, another Beeman design. Now, Pullman lived in this mansion along with his family, allowed him to walk up to the offices that were on Michigan Avenue. It was quite away from the rabble where the actual factory people would have lived. Number of little scandals concerning him. Right around just a few years before his death, a guy came up, knocked on the door, and said, "Hey, that guy was my father. I need to see his body." It's a guy named Ferdinand Friedrich Gustav Bering. Apparently on her deathbed, his mother had told him George Pullman, the the railroad king of Chicago, was your father. And he kind of became convinced it was true. He probably thought it really was. He attended the funeral of Pullman from across the street, just kind of like standing across and looking into the window. Then he just kind of faded from the news after that. He claimed that he didn't want money, only recognition. Right. But here is Pullman and his family, including his two sons, George Jr. and Walter Sanger Pullman. These kids were trouble. They were among the least popular kids in school, and around here they went to the Harvard School, which was down in Kenwood. This is the same school where Leopold and Loeb would go a generation later, the most notable murderers of the 1920s, or among the most famous anyway. They were known as being real snobs. They got kicked out of one fancy school after another, got in trouble constantly, were kind of, upon Pullman's death, people started writing articles saying, "Let this be a warning to rich people for the worthless lives of their sons." And Pullman was very much aware of this. He left each of them $3,000 in his will. And when that happened, George Jr.'s fiance broke up with him when she found out he wasn't inheriting his father's millions. So he went and became engaged to a woman named Blanche, then broke off with her to steal his brother's fiancée while still carrying on an affair with Blanche. Walter Sanger died in a riding accident in 1905, probably driving around drunk. George Jr. had already died of pneumonia by then. And once again, the newspapers got to have a lot of little articles about the worthless lives of rich men's sons. Here's this one. It is said that one night's carousal cost the old man Pullman $18,000, and that all the damage was done in one saloon. It's difficult to imagine in the 1880s how you could possibly do $18,000 worth of damage. The buildings didn't cost that much. This rich man's son is only one example of the useless lives of young men raised in luxury. Here's how he looked at the time of his death. Died at his Belmont home. He looked rather sickly there. He kind of looks like... frankly, he looks like a pamphlet about the evils of masturbation that might have been published around the time of his life. This is what it will do to you. But now, just across the corner from where that would have been, now Pullman's house would have been over on the left where that tree is growing from. The old massacre tree was hit by lightning one day. Pullman gave some chunks of it. Even though he didn't technically own it, he graciously gave some chunks of it with his name attached to the Historical Society. But just across the street is another Solon Beeman joint. And this was the home of the Kimballs, W.W. and Ava Kimball of the Kimball Piano Company. Now, Mr. Kimball did not know much about pianos, honestly. But when he was dealing in real estate for a while, one of his clients who had gone bankrupt paid him in pianos. And he turned around and sold those pianos for a quick profit and realized, hey, I'm in the wrong business. And this is what came of it. Now, his wife, like a lot of high society wives, became an art expert. Her thing was collecting the old masters. She was trying to have a complete collection of old masters, which to her meant one painting by each of the masters. Perhaps the most famous of the ones that she bought was Rembrandt's Old Man with a Gold Watch Chain, which she bought for something like $100,000 or $150,000, and is now worth probably $100 or $150 million. It is now in the Art Institute. So, in the 1940s, they added this coach house over next to it. I'll just move in there a little bit. And I've always kind of thought that the design of the coach house was kind of meant to subtly evoke piano keys. You see that same thing on their tomb at Graceland Cemetery. This kind of subtle look of the black and white keys of a piano. Now, incidentally, for a while in the 1940s, the house was run by one of the architectural foundations in the city, and there's an anecdote that goes around that in the 1920s, Al Capone tried to buy the place. Whether, in fact, that is true, I have no idea, but it went around much earlier than most Al Capone stories, so at least it has that going for it. And from here, let's spin around a little bit. Just on the other side is the Glessner House, a fine example of the style known as Richardsonian Romanesque, built for a guy by the name of John J. Glessner, who was a farm equipment baron, and his wife Frances, who was a notable diarist. A lot of what we know about this neighborhood and what life was really like for people like this comes from her meticulous diary keeping. It was designed by probably the first real superstar architect of the United States, Henry Hobson Richardson, sitting here looking like Falstaff. They also like to pose dressed like this. He kind of believed that tied him into the old medieval tradition of architecture. Also, it was just easy to get on and off. It was kind of like wearing sweatpants all day. You also see a few of his other things still surviving around Chicago, like the tomb of Steel Baron O.W. Potter and his daughter, the author Margaret Potter, over at Graceland Cemetery. And you can see some of the same motifs showing up here. You see like the arch over the door, and the same arch over the door right here. Now, when this place was built, it attracted a lot of attention just because it looked so different from everything else. Most people were building like the chateau style, as they called the Kimball house across the street. He built this thing that, to me, always kind of looked like Fort Sumter or something. The Chicago Daily News said he has just moved into his queer-looking mansion, which the great Richardson designed at the corner of 18th Street and Prairie. The house, which was taken by the untutored for a stable, a factory, or a bowling alley, the desired architect considered one of his best works. We like our artists to be a little bit bizarre. It helps us to remind us of how normal we are. Now, George Glessner, a son of the family, was an amateur photographer. This is a photograph that he made of the massacre tree. It would have been made by standing on the corner in front of the place and just looking down towards what is now Battle of Fort Dearborn Park. And you see at the time, that was it. Lakeshore Drive wasn't there yet. Soldier Field wasn't there yet. You just had this, and then you were pretty much at the lake. And their daughter, Frances Glessner, ended up being one of the pioneers of forensics. She got really interested in murder mysteries. And she realized that at the time, detective work was not really a science yet. The job of a detective was to get a hunch and then prove it by any means necessary. Often this meant drugging the suspects, torturing the suspects, beating the suspects into a confession. This kind of thing happened all the time. Intimidating witnesses. So she developed what was called nutshell studies, which were effectively dollhouses that recreated murder scenes that could be used to help aspiring detectives learn the tools of their trade. They would recreate these things absolutely perfectly. There was even electricity and everything, so they could go through and try to find out what the clues really were. She made dozens of these. A few of them are still in existence, and I believe a couple of them are even still in use today for training purposes. So not every wealthy person's children have completely useless lives like George Pullman did. We'll zip across the street one more time here. An older one here. This is a mansion known as the Coleman Ames house. Originally built for a guy named Joseph Coleman, who was a hardware baron who only lived here for a couple of years before a coal merchant named Miner Ames moved in, and he lived there for 2 years himself before dying. It's almost like the place was cursed. First two residents only lived there briefly. Designed by a guy named Henry Ives Cobb, who was going to come up again. He built stuff all over Chicago. There's a lot of stuff on the River North tour that was built by him. A couple of things back on the Gold Coast tour that we did last weekend. Now, eventually, in 1907, a guy by the name of Joseph Fish moved in. This is his wife, Mrs. Fish. And he was an insurance guy. Mrs. Fish was involved in a whole lot of Jewish civic organizations and high society functions and kept monkeys in the house. Little Arthur Meeker Jr., who was a little kid next door, said that we were really fascinated by this family, partly because they were Jewish and they didn't know anybody else who was Jewish, and of course partly because they had monkeys. And Arthur wrote in his diary that his mother was horrified when she heard him talking about, does that mean the monkeys are Jewish too? And of course, the classic joke answer is only if the monkeys' mothers are Jewish, but I say patrilineally Jewish monkeys are still Jewish monkeys. And if you think otherwise, you probably just want your religion to be a country club. That's a good way to start a fight on Twitter, talking like that. But Joseph Fish worked in the fire insurance business, and then one day he got bribed by a guy who said, if you don't pay me off, I'm going to say that you're the one telling me where to set fires. Fish declined to pay this guy off. It was a guy by the name of David the Torch Korshak. David the Torch Korshak, you can probably guess where he got that name from. He used to torch places to get the insurance money. And he went around saying that, nope, all along Joseph Fish has been my fixer. He was the one who made sure that the insurance company paid out. He's the one who told me where to set all of the fires. It was all him this whole time. And this led to a really long trial. His name was dragged through the mud repeatedly. The prosecutors were really absolutely out for blood, not only presenting evidence, they admitted they didn't really have a whole lot of evidence. So instead, they just fell straightly onto character assassinations. In the last speech, the prosecutor closed by saying, I thank God not all men are such miserable scoundrels as Joseph Fish. He was looking at years and years in prison. However, there really wasn't any evidence against him. So he was eventually acquitted in 1914. One of the jurors who was interviewed later said, well, what it came down to is we couldn't make heads or tails out of any of the evidence that was presented. We just had to go on the character testimonies. Now, Mr. Fish had a whole lot of well-respected people testifying as to his good character. The people who were testifying against him were all a bunch of crooks. So we kind of went with the more respectable people. And I was never able to form an opinion as to whether or not he was actually working as a fixer for the arsonist. I suspect probably not, just because, again, that we're going strictly on the word of some arsonist here. Now, David Korshak's nephew ended up being one of the biggest fixers in Las Vegas, and then later a bigger fixer in Los Angeles. What was that guy's name? I got it written down here. No, I don't have it written down here, but his son was a big fixer. The head of Paramount Studio once said, one nod from Korshak, Vegas shuts down. Let's go across the street. Or down the block a little. Now, this is a relatively new development that you see over here called the Resmar Mansions. Much more recently built, 1990s or so, filling up a whole blank space. In the early 1900s, between income tax suddenly becoming a thing and just these old-fashioned Victorian styles going completely out of style and seeming anachronistic, a lot of these places ended up being torn down. Among other things, they had also built more railroad tracks nearby, so there was soot and noise all the time. It just wasn't a fashionable place to be anymore. So, right about where these would have been was a house built for Joseph Sears. It's this larger one here that you see over the lighter colored one. Later modified quite a bit. But it was originally designed by Daniel Burnham for Joseph Sears, who is not the department store guy. He's the founder of the suburb of Kenilworth. Worked for the American Cotton Oil Company. Now, eventually, this is where the Meekers moved in. Little Arthur Meeker was the kid who would eventually become who would eventually become a travel writer and write down his reminiscences about his fascination with the monkeys who lived next door. But this is how it looked like after all of their modifications. Now, Daniel Burnham, the original architect, as seen in this mural by Candace Johnson, which also features me right next to him, staring him down. Burnham is the architect who famously said, "Make no little plans, they have no magic in them to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high and hope and in work." It's a shame that this one's gone. It's amazing how many Daniel Burnham buildings we lost in the city over the years. But this was occupied by the Meeker family, including Grace Murray Meeker over here on the right, who in her later days was one of the great sources of anecdotes about how lovely life was back in the old high society days, back in the Gilded Age. Talking about the great design, how much the clothes seemed to be lovelier. People used to put so much more work into their good grooming habits. If she were alive today, she'd be ripping on millennials for sure. Kind of lived in a haze of nostalgia. Over there on the left in the top hat is her son, Arthur Meeker Jr., who wrote a whole novel about Prairie Avenue, but mostly worked as a travel writer, but also had a column for like Chicago Magazine. Talked about fun anecdotes about his mother, talking about the Field family affairs, talking about how we simply don't go below 22nd Street. And Arthur would echo that in his column in Chicago Magazine in the 20s, saying we must all admit that the West Side simply does not really even exist. Prairie Avenue is a pretty entertaining read, though. Arthur wrote some very amusing stuff. He was born at kind of the tail end of the Gilded Age, so he experienced all of this stuff, but he saw it from a certain detachment. Later on, he would say things like, in the late 19th century, taste in America was as bad as it's ever been, and he would talk about these old houses as though they were the most disgusting things you could possibly imagine. A couple of doors down from them, over on the right, at 1827, was the Duane House, which was owned by a tea company owner and was the first on the block to have electricity built right in. So by putting some of these up, we can kind of recreate what it was like before it started to look like this. Which they at least did make these townhouses look as though they were able to fit in. It was a nice touch on their part, on the developer's part. But we'll spin around from here a bit. Now, some letters between Arthur and his parents survive from later in their lives. Main takeaway from it that interests us today is they were not happy that he was gay. This is not the original location of this place, but this is the Henry Clark House. It was first built by a hardware guy named Henry B. Clark. It was said to be modeled after Mayor Ogden's house, our first mayor, but I've never found even a drawing of what Mayor Ogden's house looked like, so it's hard to tell for sure. But this actually was a block or two away from here. It was a little bit further north. When Henry B. Clark died in the 1849 cholera epidemic, his last request was to be buried on the property. He said, "I don't want to be buried in the city cemetery. They're just tossing all of the cholera deaths into one big pit, and they're going to lose track of where everybody is. Just bury me right here." So they buried him on the lakeshore, and for a generation or so, it was a commonly pointed out site. When people went around Old Prairie Avenue, they would point out, "Oh, there's the grave of old Mr. Clark." He and his wife were eventually moved. When his wife died years later, they were eventually moved up to Graceland Cemetery, where they are still to this day. But there's a couple of missing houses here, stuff that used to be around here. For instance, back at 1808, which would be over to the right of this, was the home of a guy by the name of Osborne Keith, one of three Keith brothers who lived around here. We're going to see a couple of these guys over time. And this was another one designed by Henry Ives Cobb. Now, this whole space had gotten to be empty for a long time, and at some point in the 1970s, when they decided we should revitalize Prairie Avenue, one of the big things was moving the Clark House, which had already been moved once. It was originally a little further north than this. Then after the Great Chicago Fire, they worried that it was too close to downtown to be safe, so they moved it clear down to the Hyde Park area. And in 1877, took it apart, packed the whole thing up, and drove it up to Prairie Avenue, which presented some problems. There were some L tracks that they couldn't really get around. They had to spend a couple of days like building a wall to get it over the L tracks, as diagrammed here. Move over to the side of this a little bit. Just over the immediate left of the Clark House, we can see this is about what the block would have looked like back in the day before all of these mansions came down. Or there's a bird's eye view like this. This would have us starting a little bit further over to the side. The Clark House would have been right about where 824 is right now. 834 was the home of a guy by the name of Fernando Jones. We'll kind of position that right here so we can kind of recreate in our mind's eye where this would have been. It would have been right about here. Now, Fernando Jones was one of the old settlers of Chicago and never let anybody forget about it. They called him the Dean of Chicago Pioneers, which is probably by his own request. He came here when he was just a teenager, killed him a wolf when he was only 15, right at about the corner of Dearborn and Washington. He was the founder of the Chicago Title and Trust, came into town with a boatload of hardware. His wife was a major suffragist. And newspapers would call him things like Chicago Incarnate. Again, this was probably his own idea. There's the story of him killing the wolf, which he must have told again and again and again. I just noticed this thing. I was just reading about E.P. Weston, the famous walker. There was a guy who would walk through a town now and then on his cross-country walks. It was just a huge deal. Apparently Fernando Jones thought he was an even bigger deal than that. In fact, one of the very first mentions of the term Windy City was 1867 when Weston Fuller came in and a newspaper said the Windy City is in a state of excitement. And then up on the top there at his 90th birthday, he told the story again about how all the Potawatomi were terrified of Halley's Comet until he told them otherwise. This guy might have been really entertaining for a brief period at a time, but eventually I imagine he would just get to be kind of insufferable to hang around. He also claimed that he was the person riding in the canoe in this picture that we saw earlier. Now we'll just put this side by side for a second. Here's him. Here's the canoe. Yeah, Fernando, I'm not really seeing the resemblance here. But he was a particularly good friend of David Kennison, the guy who still has a marker in Lincoln Park. This is where Fernando Jones told him to put the marker, where he said Kennison was buried. Kennison was the guy who had claimed that he was 115 years old and the last survivor of the Boston Tea Party. Upon his death, it was Jones that he gave a little vial of tea leaves from the Boston Tea Party that he said to give to the Chicago Historical Society. And they've still got him, even though we now know pretty well beyond doubt that David Kennison was lying through his teeth. Something Jones should have known too, but he couldn't resist being the best friend of a guy from the Boston Tea Party. Now, eventually, he decided to go overseas in 1877, and while he was overseas, he needed somebody to take care of the house. Meanwhile, Wilbur F. Story of the Chicago Times needed a place to stay while his giant mansion down on Grand Boulevard was being built. Now, we all know what I think of Wilbur F. Story of the Chicago Times around here. A couple of his articles include, From White Manville, or his thoughts on abolitionism. This one is abolitionary is necessarily growing worse and worse. This guy hated abolitionists, hated people of races other than his own, was kind of out of his mind, would write these horrible fire-eating editorials, but 1877 he had lost what marbles he had and started building himself this massive palace. And he was just supposed to be living here while Fernando Jones was out of town and while this place was being built, but construction dragged on for years and years, and when Fernando Jones came back, Wilbur F. Story refused to get out of the house. He wrote a couple of letters dictated by the voices in his head talking about how bad the place and therefore how bad Fernando Jones smelled. He ended up dying in the house, so this spot right here is the spot where Wilbur F. Story died. And we all know what I think of Wilbur F. Story dying. I'll move down just a little bit. Now, a little bit further down was Mr. Alderton's house. Alderton was the founder of the Union Stockyards. His son, Robert, was half of what is now usually recognized as the first legally recognized same-sex union. The judge wouldn't let he and his partner get married, so he let him adopt his partner. There's actually some paperwork from that related to that on file at Graceland. He and his partner inherited the family plot. Now, we just talked about back at 1808 was Edson Keith's house. This was the home of Elbridge Keith, and I absolutely love this house. I love that it is even still standing. This one, it looks like something out of Scooby-Doo. Just add bats, you know. And just to the right, the Keith brothers, Edson, Elbridge, and Osborne, ran a fur and hat company, and all lived within this same little block of Prairie Avenue. Osborne was a little over to the right next to the Glessner house, and just next door to the left was the Edson Keith house. There's a couple of vintage shots of this one. This one you can see Edson's house over on the left and Fernando Jones's house over on the right. Interesting ad they put in here. Man with reference wanted experience as window trimmer and floor walker from Madison, Wisconsin, in the Keith brothers' house. Jewish preferred. This is Edson Keith, who lived next door. Now, Edson Keith made the news once in particular at the time of his death in 1896. One day he walked out of that place and walked across the street, left his coat on the beach, and then apparently walked into the lake. This was kind of shocking at the time. It was eventually ruled to be death by means of temporary insanity, which happened that was almost always the ruling when a rich person died by suicide in those days. They weren't really comfortable with the idea of mental health. They would always try to come up with something, well, his health must have been bad, or he must have experienced financial reverses. And when they couldn't find something like that, they would just fall back on temporary insanity. But he was last seen in what was said to be a demented condition, walking into the water by an old fisherman, as it says right there. Unfortunately, of the Keith houses that were here, only one of them still survives. We'll zip around from here a bit. And just on the other side, first of all, there's a little park space that keeps it being a street for through traffic. This is said to be a relic from an old Chicago church, but nobody's sure which one, and nobody exactly seems to believe that it's entirely true. But right behind it, where this newer one is now, would have been the home of Marshall Field. And that's Marshall Field himself. It's a picture of it from a book from the 1930s when it was still standing. And the last known portrait of Marshall Field himself. Marshall lived in this place along with his wife Nanny Field and their children. Now, most famously, Marshall Field himself, the department store king, was a famously dull man. Didn't really have any friends. He had golfing buddies and he had business associates, but nobody who has ever really been found who seems to have really liked the guy. He was never really close with much of anybody. Yet, he and his wife Nanny held perhaps the biggest party that ever happened in this place. When their son Marshall Field Jr. turned 17, they held what was called the Mikado Ball. This was a ball based on the Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. Everything was Japanese wherever you could look. It is occasionally reported that this party cost $75,000. This for a guy who paid his cash boys $2 a week. You can do the math of how long any given one of his employees would have had to work in order to make enough money to throw a party like this. It tends to be decades and decades, if not centuries and centuries. It was later pointed out, though, in the press that wasn't a $75,000 ball. It was more like $5,000, which, if you adjust for inflation, was about $75,000 in today's money. According to one report, about $2,000 was spent just on photographs, which almost can't be true because there are so few photographs for it that are all that easily available. This is about the only one I ever see. And this is a picture of a few of the kids who are at the place. Ethel Field is in the middle. On the left is Alice Keith, who was a daughter of Osborne Keith, who lived down the block. And on the right is Flo Otis, who is a member of the Otis family that we talk about at Graceland Cemetery now and then. Now, this was a party that people reminisced about for years and years and years. And when it was happening, Marshall was already having an affair on the side with Delia Caton, who lived almost directly behind them. There's long-standing rumors that there was a tunnel that connected the two for them to carry on their affair, which both of their spouses knew about and which Grace Murray Meeker knew all about, but nobody really said anything. That's another thing that came up around at the time. There was, at the time of it, the big popular kind of party to have at the time was hobby horse races. This was written about in a couple of places. This is the way they do it in Chicago. And yeah, that can confirm. That is the way we do it in Chicago. Move just a bit down here. Now, that house was designed by Richard Hunt. Just a couple doors down was the Solon Beeman designed home of Marshall Field Jr. That, of course, was Marshall Field's son, the subject of the Mikado Ball. It was celebrating his birthday. Now, he married initially a woman by the name of Albertine Huck, whose father built the Huck Mausoleum here. He was a brewer in Chicago who initially married a woman named Clara Kenkel, who was an opera singer. But when his wife died, his three daughters were married off. One had married Marshall Field Jr., Albertine. A couple others had married into nobility. And he ended up marrying his daughter's best friend, his daughter Albertine's best friend, Paula. But this is Albertine, in all of her elegance, married to Marshall Field Jr. But then in 1905, Marshall Field Jr. was found bleeding to death from a shotgun wound on the inside of this house. Now, the official story that everybody was told was that he had been cleaning a pistol that he planned to take hunting in Wisconsin. But the story that went around for everybody else was that he had been at the Everleigh Club, the fanciest brothel in town, just a few blocks away, and got into a fight with one of the bouncers. And having been shot, they brought him back to his house to allow him the dignity of dying at home, not at a brothel, and also to spare the good name of the Everleigh Club. It may have also been a suicide as well. These stories were kind of suppressed by everybody except the Chicago American. Marshall Field had threatened to pull his advertising from any newspaper that would report on anything untoward here, but the Chicago American already didn't get his advertising. So, as an experiment while I was doing the filming, I decided to find out how far of a walk was it from Marshall Field Jr.'s place over to the Everleigh Club. Let's find out, shall we? Now, the Everleigh Club looked about like this. And here we pass the old Second Presbyterian Church. Inside are some fantastic windows. Just walking along. You can see the Sears Tower off in the distance in that shot. And here we are at these Bertrand Goldberg designed senior living places. This is where the Everleigh Club stood, so it only would have been that far of a walk. And while I was out there filming, on the ground was a mysterious pair of underpants. Always love to find street underpants. So, the story went around that officially it had been an accidental shooting. This was the Chicago Evening American would even show these things, show a picture of the gun, and to point out that you couldn't really accidentally shoot this thing even if you tried. But the story just kind of stuck. He died after a couple of days. Marshall himself died only weeks afterward, which meant that his son, Marshall Field III, was suddenly what newspapers called the most interesting boy in the world. All of a sudden, this kid who was about 12 years old, was suddenly heir to one of the largest fortunes anywhere. And also, he was, his brother Henry lived there too. Now, Henry and Marshall Jr. went off to England after this. There was a trust for like 40% of the Field Foundation. They grew up largely in London. Then, as a teenager, Henry apparently got a young Palace Theater Follies girl named Peggy Marsh pregnant, then moved back to Chicago and said, "I'm going to send for you any day," then married someone else. Marshall Jr. arranged for the woman to be paid off on the day of Henry's wedding. Peggy Marsh and the baby just kind of disappeared weeks later. Henry himself died right after the wedding after an infection after having his tonsils taken out. Marshall III went on to serve in World War I, came back and lived like the Great Gatsby for a while working as an investment banker, and had some nice lines like, listen, I happen to inherit a great deal of money, but if I can't earn three squares a day, I'm not really worth it. He then went on to found a couple of newspapers. Owned the Chicago Daily News and the Sun-Times at one point, which then passed on to Marshall IV. Let's move over to the corner a little bit here. At these three cool houses on Cullerton, 213, 215, and 217. Now, 213, over there on the left, is known as the Charles Purdy House, and in the 1940s, it was the home of a guy by the name of Fred Morelli, who worked for the old First Ward Alderman, Hinky Dink Kenna, and took over as the precinct captain of the First Ward in 1944. Here he is in front of the old Colosimos Cafe walking his dog. Mike Royko of him wrote, The men decide. The new First Ward political boss will be Fred Morelli, who was a protege of a big vice operator and later got into the jukebox business. The First Ward was his juke territory. You didn't have to get a jukebox from Morelli if you didn't want to. Not at all. You could provide your customers canary music instead. So Fred Morelli ended up being the head of the jukebox racket, working with Greasy Thumb Gusick, who had been a fixer for Al Capone back in the day. Jukebox racket was a big thing in those days. The jukebox people controlled, kind of informed saloon owners what kind of jukebox they could have, and especially what songs would be on the jukebox. 215, the little one in the middle, I couldn't find a whole lot of interesting stuff other than a certain renumbering guide saying that this was the Charles Purdy house, not the one next door. It was the home of a guy who was the house physician at the Grand Pacific. About all I can really find about this is in 215, some guy got in trouble for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Oops. That could have meant just about anything, though. 217, the one on the right, was the home of J.J. and May M. Gibson, who moved in about 1905. These two had been the official studio photographers of the World's Fair back in the day. These are they took pictures of all of the acts who came through the fair. All of the studio portraits. And also, like one of the innovations of the 1893 World's Fair was photo IDs. They were the ones who took all of the photo IDs. After her husband died, she got involved in a real love triangle. This woman sued her for trying to steal her husband. She said, no, we only have a working relationship. But then after the divorce was final, she ended up suing him for a breach of promise contract because apparently he had promised to marry her, then didn't. It was quite a long thing. So in her later years, she mostly concentrated on reminiscing about the World's Fair. She founded an organization called the Society of 93ers. People who had worked for the World's Fair, that eventually they expanded it to pretty much anybody who remembered the World's Fair. And I am going way over time today, so we'll just go down a little bit further. We'll go back up around here. This is an old printing office that is now condos and lofts, because of course it is. Now, in the middle here, this older-looking one is known as the William Henry Reed House. It was the home of a businessman named William Henry Reed, who, this will go on right, yeah, wrote an autobiography, William Henry Reed's Recollections of a Busy Life. This is possibly the single most boring book ever written. The thing that he said, he got his name William Henry because he was born on the day that his parents had found out that William Henry Harrison had won the election. But that is the single most interesting thing in his autobiography. The rest, he just kind of recaps what the big news stories were in any given year without really saying how they impacted him or what he had to do with any of them. Then the whole last third of it was just all of his business transactions. For a while, he worked in a drug company with Peter Van Schack, but he was out of that business before they got swindled by H.H. Holmes, so he lost his one chance at a good anecdote to tell later. Ended his book with financial statements. It was a total snore. He said he believed in the virtues of patience, prudence, perseverance, persistence, and I would add, plodding. Mostly plodding. The book is like reading We Didn't Start the Fire without the catchy chorus. We'll move just down a tiny bit more. This is called the Harriet Reese House by Henry Ives Cobb that we talked about earlier. Now, she was the wife of a realtor who moved into this place. Sold it in 1892 to Edson Keith Jr., whose daughter Catherine Keith married David Adler, the architect, who designed things like the attic club that went into the field building. She died in a horrible wreck abroad after writing a couple of novels herself. She wrote a couple of novels. One is about a young woman whose husband has an affair, but then she gets pregnant and the husband sees the error of his ways and they lived happily ever after. I doubt that it particularly holds up today. But eventually, this place used to be located a couple of blocks further south. It was moved up to this location, which is quite an upgrade. It used to be just below 22nd Street, where Grace Murray Meeker said, respectable people, we don't go below 22nd Street. Though they did all the time. There was a photography studio down there. There was an ice skating rink where all of the kids went. It was still very well to do for a few blocks below 22nd. Quite a few blocks, really. Then, for a while, this place became the Prairie Cafe. Fancy lunch place. It was relocated in 2014. I moved down just a little bit further to close out. Down at the end, I couldn't find a particularly good picture of this, but at 2035 was the home of H.O. Stone. Here's H.O. Stone at the Sauganash Hotel as depicted in ads for his mortgage brokering company years and years on. What he's probably best known for in Chicago now was commissioning the statue of his second wife, Frances Pierce Stone. Now, when he was about 43, he went back to his hometown in upstate New York, met Frances, who was about 16, married her, moved back to Chicago, where she died of tuberculosis, commissioned this statue, went back to his hometown, found another teenager to marry, and that would have been Elizabeth Yeager. Elizabeth Yeager ended up living in this house and outliving her husband by 37 years. As one does when your husband is like 37 years older than you to begin with. And she was remembered by Arthur Meeker Jr. as the most bland person on the planet. Perfect match for Marshall Field. She was very stern, very uptight, very prim and proper. But she did, at one point, when Oscar Wilde came through Chicago, she held a reception for him at the house. At this place, not only was she a horrible mismatch with the flamboyant Oscar Wilde, but Marshall Field was there too. I really wish there was more data about what happened at the party where Oscar Wilde met Marshall Field. Though I think all that we really have is like some vague things about Wilde talked about what words were different in the United States than they were back in England. I'll cover just one more down to the corner. We'll actually go across 22nd Street for a bit. Oh, down here at 21st would have been Philip Armour's house, the Armour hot dogs guy. Around the same place was the Getty home, the home of Alice Getty, who now has the Getty Mausoleum at Graceland Cemetery. But right over on the left-hand side, about where that van is parked now, would have been a photography studio of a guy by the name of Commodore Steffens, who took a lot of photographs of the high-class Chicago people around here, including probably the last photograph of Marshall Field himself. And here's a photograph that he took of Bertha Palmer. And this one is someone who is completely unknown, but I just love this photograph. It's just haunting. The look that he captured on her is just absolutely stunning. All right, Rob, hint taken. But all right, I've gone a little bit over today. So let me go ahead and plug the upcoming events here. Now, on Thursday night, I'm bringing back The Strange Tale of the Cardinella Gang, which I have done exactly once back in May of 2020, over a year and a half ago now. Sam Cardinella was a guy a few blocks away from Prairie Avenue in the 1910s who ran a pool room where he would allure young children and teenagers in, and once he had them kind of under his spell, he would teach them to commit crimes and send them out on errands. It was almost like he had read Oliver Twist and thought that it was a how-to manual. When the cops broke up the gang, they had been into hundreds of holdups and more than a few murders. But after his execution in 1921, he had a plot to be brought back from the dead. And this is all actually pretty well verified, but I uncovered some files down in Springfield that make a very strong case that he was actually innocent the entire time. So that'll all be on the Strange Tale of the Cardinella Gang on Thursday night back here at 8 p.m. It wasn't a high numbers one last time, but it's such a cool story. It needs to be better known in Chicago history. So yeah, I'll add something for next Sunday as well. We still do morning mini tours every day at 10 o'clock. The only day I missed was on Friday of this week. I was on an airplane at the time, but I was on an airplane with Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago. Got to the gate, and there she was, just sitting there in a sweatshirt, jeans, and Nikes. Never would. I don't think anybody at either airport, either in D.C. or Chicago, anybody else even realized who it was. Now, should you need a Mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, hoodie, etc., just go to cafepress.com/mysteriouschicago. They have got flasks, they have got drinkware, they have got everything you need to show off your Mysterious Chicago pride. And with that, everybody, I am just going to put the Benny Goodman back on, and we will hang out like we always do, and the cats, I think, are still waiting to play. So thanks for joining me, everybody. I am Adam Seltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours. Take it away, Benny. We can make this a bit smaller. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Heather. I'm just drinking tea today. Hey, Marita. Hey, Ellen. Hey, Andrea. Thanks, Dana. Oh, hello, Ellen. Oh, Lynn. Hello. I was kind of in this weird headspace right after I finished these. George, next time I'm at your grave, I'll pour one out for you. How about that? Thanks, Jody, Chris, and Kelly. Is the book Murder Maps going to be adapted for a TV show? No idea. I still haven't actually seen the TV show. But it's the same publisher that did the Murder Maps UK book. Now, Octavio, I didn't end up talking to the mayor any. She was just there, had the mask on and everything. But even with the mask on, you recognize Lori when you see her. And she was sitting in row 12 like a regular mortal. I think she did have some plainclothes security around her. But again, you never would have known if you didn't recognize her. I know Patty has done a couple of events with her lately. So she was saying, oh, go mention my name to her, but I didn't have a chance. That's all right. Hey, did you guys see, my first thought was to say something about, taking on the FOP. I was on I-90 yesterday coming back from the tour. Saw that the Fort Lauderdale Police Department has a billboard up on I-90 to recruit Chicago cops to move down to Fort Lauderdale. I just gotta wonder who looks at stories of the Chicago police from any point in history and thinks, that's the guys we need down here. Florida men, that's who. Thanks, Todd. Yeah, Chris, that's the thrust of the billboard. It shows a squad car on a beach and says, "Wish you were here. Fort Lauderdale PD is now hiring." Happy birthday, Ryan. Joanne, I don't know the Fort Lauderdale police that well, but it would be a pretty low. They'd have to have a pretty low bar. And most of my interactions with the Chicago police have been very professional, except for the ones that really haven't. Yeah, I know delivery on Murder Maps has gotten pushed back a bit. He got hit by the supply chain gremlins.
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her.
I still haven't actually seen a copy myself. Oh, hey, buddy. Here's Miles. Oh, hey, Priya. And Priya has popped in, too. Which I guess means they think it's time to do some jumping. I did promise him as such. Come on, you're so excited to come jump. Up on down. Come on, Miles, jump down. Miles just kind of caught it. There we go. There we go. Show all the nice people what a great jumper you are.
Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Alright, Priya is now hiding under the couch. Yeah, they love this thing. It's... I can't keep them away from it. You want to do some jumps too? Jump too, Priya. Oh, good try, Priya. You're a little clumsy with this. Now, Priya lands on her feet moderately less than Miles does. You also can see a lot of this on Whiskey and a Cookie these days. As I broadcast Whiskey and a Cookie from the desk, and these days, Miles especially will not let me sit on the desk unmolested. Carol Aiden's doing great. Lane, sorry we missed you today. You want to do one of your big ones? I haven't seen you do one of your really big flops. There you go. There was one of her big ones. Patty, I think Aiden's class enjoyed the book. All right, Miles. Take a bow. Take a bow. Yep. Have a good week, Kathy. Oh man, I got nothing to make for lunch tonight.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and we stay right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and hear Helen Ward sing Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo.
I'll see you tomorrow, Todd. I haven't made any latkes this year. I'm not great with latkes. Jackie, I hear you. I'm getting kind of in need of a nap myself here. Betsy, that's tempting. I had one the other night, though. But I am fully out of groceries. Thanks, Rosemary. Okay, Miles. Okay.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
It'll be safer if you just come down here, Miles. Miles is caught, and I think he wants to take me for a walk now. Where are we going, Miles? Whoa. Ah. Trying to trip me up or what? Sarah, you want to go to a neighborhood called Sauganash. That's where you'll find the best lights. And one of these nights we'll go out there and I'll probably live stream a bit. Good luck with the surgery, Audrey. Carol's not snowing here last I checked. Let me see. It's just kind of raining here. Lynn, yes I did. Thank you for noticing. You know, the concert in D.C. the other day was Vax only, but they had a booth set up outside the venue where you could go as early as like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and get your wristband. That worked out well. No books by me at Half Price Books in Skokie? Well. When I find my books in a used bookstore, I'm like, oh man, somebody must have died. That's a shame.
Right invitation at the beginning of his program. Let's dance.
But alright, everybody, I am getting really hungry. I gotta go scrounge up something to have for lunch. So in the meantime, here's Miles, helping me to tell you all to once again plug this very rare presentation of The Strange Tale of the Cardinella Gang on Thursday night at 8 o'clock. And until then, everybody, I'll see you tomorrow for Mural Monday, I'm sure. But other than that, stay safe, stay strong, and of course, if at all humanly possible, ladies and gentlemen, stay spooky.